and I'll introduce you. So here we are. I'm Kelly T. Woods, and I'm in Anacortes, Washington. And my guest on this seminar today is James Hazelrig, my good friend and colleague from Texas. And he has a practice in Austin. And tell me the name of your town. Is it Bastrop? Is that how you pronounce it? Your hometown?
So I live actually in a rural area in Bastrop County,
Oh,
Bastrop, Bastrop. Though a friend of mine came to visit, and I took her to see the bridge over the Colorado River, and she said, "Is this where you drop the bass in the river?" And I'm like, "What?" And she says, "You live in Bastrop." No, not Bastrop, Bastrop. Not to be confused with Bastrop, Louisiana. I always have to specify Texas when I do a Google search. And as long as we're on pronunciation, a lot of people know me online and they don't actually ever hear my name. It's actually Hazel, like a hazel tree, Hazelrig. I know
yeah, I don't
it's
think I've ever
confusing.
actually called you by your first name or your second name. So I just always known you as James, and especially I know you as James, the hypnotic storyteller, because this is really one of your many fortes. You're an experienced performer and have done this for, I imagine, a large part of your life. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how that all led you into not just storytelling, but applying that in hypnosis?
Sure. So, I kind of came to storytelling and to hypnosis through multiple routes. First off, I'm human, and humans are natural storytelling creatures. That's how we convey information. A lot of people say, "Well, I'm not really a storyteller," and I say, "Oh, how was your day?" "Oh, what?" and they suddenly become amazing stories. But I did have a few advantages. My father was really a great storyteller, and according to him, his mother was a great storyteller before him. I never got to meet her. I'm the youngest child of a youngest child, so she was dead long before I was born. Um, but I grew up with my dad telling all kinds of different stories, including a lot of stories about his childhood and about his ancestry going back going back to the Civil War, and actually back to the English Civil War, which happened several centuries before that. And I realized at one point that these stories had a pattern, and they kind of had a message about what it meant to be a Hazelrig. Sir Arthur Hazelrig stood up to the crown in the English Civil War, and then he stood up to Cromwell because he felt that Cromwell wasn't living up to the promises that he had made. And as a result, died in London Tower. He was one of the only regicides, rebels against the crown, who weren't pardoned when Charles II came in. And there were very similar stories about my dad growing up as a migrant laborer, essentially a sharecropper during the Depression. And at one point, I actually hit the age to go, some of these stories might not be 100% accurate. It's possible that maybe my ancestors were not all these amazing, great heroes, but it didn't matter. At that point, it had inspired me to the idea that I was supposed to be somebody who was brave and resourceful and determined. So my dad instilled that in me through these stories. Now, as I grew up and moved away from home, I happened to hit upon the hobby of medieval reenactment. And in medieval reenactment societies, people put on real armor made out of real metal, and they hit each other with real sticks, and they hit each other real hard. And I tried that, and I very quickly learned that I'm bad at it. But at night, they gather around a campfire and they tell each other stories. And these stories likewise convey the culture of that organization. And that's what the job of a bard is in that subculture. And I discovered very quickly that I was pretty good at that. And in fact, I practiced and got a lot better. An amazing storyteller in that organization took me under her wing, made me her apprentice, really got to learn and practice a lot of that kind of thing. Now, at the same time, I was working on a master's degree in English. And of course, literature is simply written down stories. So I was studying story from a number of different angles. And my goal was not to become a hypnotist at all. The only thing I knew about hypnosis really were the stories my mother had told me, because she had used hypnosis to control the pain of childbirth starting in the late 50s. So every time there was the birthday for me or one of my siblings, she would recount the story of our birth. And every one of them involved showing those stupid doctors that hypnosis was powerful and it worked. And so eventually I hit a point in my life where I needed to do something that was going to pay the bills, that was going to be fascinating and fun and interesting, and something that was going to help people, because I realized that was one of the requirements I had in life. And I looked around at all the different possibilities. I actually spent an afternoon with a professional storyteller trading stories, and at the end he said, "You should be a professional storyteller." And I said, "Oh, okay, I don't know, maybe." And a year later, I came back around to run into him on the circuit, and I said, "Hey, I took your advice. I became a hypnotist," because I had, in that time, realized hypnosis was what I wanted to do, and discovered that I had already been hypnotizing crowds of people by telling them stories.
I love that. I love your history, and I love your family history and how that was handed down to you. And I think that listeners here today were probably reflecting on their own family stories that have come through many generations. Even I know, you know, some of my background of my mother being from Finland. And so, you know, even some of the characteristics and the sisu nature, that perseverance, was handed down to me through those stories. And we don't really realize how much they're a part of us. And some of them can be helpful, and some of them can also be limiting. So, you know, and I want to tell the people here on this webinar that they can certainly ask questions of you, and someone just did. Tamara asked a question in our chat room. James, what was the timing from when you were doing your master's degree to becoming a full-time hypnotist?
Wow, that's a great question. So I completed my master's degree in 1992, and I opened my practice in 2008. So that's what, 16 years. In the interim, I was a college instructor, and I was also a test writer and editor. You know, those standardized tests that everybody hates? It's not my fault, but it was my job for a while to write those and to edit those. And so those were a
great constraint to be able to do that.
Well, you know, it did teach me, because of course the literature portions of those tests often, you know, you have to have a story at a particular reading level, and it has to have certain elements in it, because you're going to write at least 6 test questions to fit in all of those elements. So it's kind of, you know, to use that Iron Chef metaphor that we sometimes use to describe being a hypnotist, I had to take these ingredients and craft a story that was going to meet certain requirements, on top of the constraints that we weren't allowed to write about anything interesting. There's literally a list of the forbidden topics. And it was all of the other writers, and I just looked at that and shook our head and said, you know, conflict is what makes stories interesting, but we're not allowed to have any of it. We're not allowed to mention certain technology that some children might not have. And back in the day, it was VCRs, right? When writing for Florida, we couldn't mention snow, because there were children in Florida who had no idea what snow was.
Oh my
And
goodness.
I understood why these constraints existed, but man, it was a challenge. And on top of that, some days I'd show up for work and it's like, okay, I got to write 6 poems today that are going to meet these parameters. And I remember one day just sitting there thinking, this is like trying to get water from a stone. And I instantly wrote a paragraph about somebody who was so frustrated that he couldn't come up with an idea that he said it was like getting water from a stone, and then wrote a test question about it.
I love it. Perfect. And, probably a lot of the people watching this webinar here today aren't aware that you created a hypnosis course based on the history of hypnosis. And I know that HPTI offered it. I'm not, is it still on the curriculum? I'm not sure.
I don't think it's still a requirement in the curriculum. I know a lot of things are kind of in flux right now. I actually am planning to create a scaled down version of it that will just be a few hours that I will make available to people. It's on my long list of
Yeah,
things
I love
that I will
hearing.
finally get done.
Yeah, I love hearing that. And I also think that it gives you a particular perspective because of your knowledge historically. And you have such a vast knowledge that reaches back in time. And I know that you draw on that all the time. Someone in the chat room asked, Maria asked, James, did you study Milton Erickson? He was a good storyteller.
Absolutely, yeah. And that was one of the things. Of course, I didn't know who Milton Erickson was before I began studying hypnosis, and in fact, I've discovered that there are a lot of people out there in the storytelling community at large, and even in the therapeutic storytelling community, who have never heard of Milton Erickson. Um, but when I was doing my initial training, I was told about Milton Erickson and told about stories, and I went, wow, this is great. So yeah, I've studied Milton Erickson and his techniques extensively. In fact, I co-authored a book with Richard Nongard called Speak Ericksonian.
An
Um,
excellent book.
well, thank you, thank you. And I primarily wrote the storytelling chapter in that, though I did help kind of with editing and collaborating on the rest of the book.
You have lots of skills. Can you Can you succinctly explain why hypnotists should be honing their storytelling skills? Why is this an important aspect of our work?
I don't know if I can do it succinctly. I'll give it a shot. I actually kind of brainstormed a little bit about this idea. For one thing, it's the ultimate covert hypnosis. People get really excited about covert hypnosis or conversational hypnosis. This is the ultimate covert hypnosis. It's the fastest induction that exists. A certain hypnotist is famous for his 8-word induction. Well, I've got a 4-word induction, only 4 words, once upon a time. Stories are naturally trance-inducing, so we should take advantage of that quality. Every story really is about change. It's either about a character changing or about an environment changing, or it's about the reader or listener's perspective on the events changing. And what do? We do change work. So again, it's a natural tool to use. It's also a multi-tool. You can use stories before the formal trance. You can use them during the formal trance. You can use them after the formal trance. I will often tell a story that lays down an idea, that lays down a principle, and then come back to it during the formal trance. So it's a very versatile tool. Stories are the natural language of the unconscious. That's how we think about things. We think in metaphor and story. So it makes sense to speak that natural language. I told you I couldn't do this succinctly. Stories engage your clients. Stories are compelling in ways that statistics are not. And you can tell someone that a lot of people die from the damaging. But if you instead give them the image of someone dying from smoking, they're going to hold on to that much stronger. I hope this is all coming through. Every once in a while I get an alert saying that my internet is unstable.
So far, fine.
Okay, good, yeah. That is, when I moved out to the country, everybody had dial-up, and my dial-up was just as good as the dial-up in the city, so I didn't think it would ever be a problem. Yeah, and things have changed a little bit. And one final area where where storytelling really shines in hypnosis, although it can work with all clients, it's the number one approach, I think, for many people who work with children. And it's also incredibly useful for working with people with ED. And now I realize that I'm probably not talking to the right demographic for that right now.
Actually, we work with a lot of men who have ED, so you are speaking to the right demographic.
That's good. That's good. I get referrals for ED clients from some of my female colleagues who live in the area who just they don't want to deal with that, and I can't blame them. But that's the thing. And if you watch an ad for an ED medication, it's all metaphor. It's all footballs going through tires. It's all some guy smiling. It's all innuendo and implication. And so I use that there quite a bit. So I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that.
You made some great points there. And the one that really resonates with me is how stories and metaphors get the attention of that creative part of our mind, our subconscious mind. And sometimes I'll even explain to students or clients that, when we're giving the logical information, those facts about why, what healthy eating looks like, or why it's important to take brief hypnotic respites throughout your day. The subconscious mind is basically doing this. Boring. But when we start using metaphor and stories, it gets engaged, it's excited, it's speaking directly in that language that it needs. And people get that. And then they understand why sometimes what we're doing may seem a bit nonsensical or fanciful or even childlike. And they can allow themselves to go with that flow even more easily.
Yeah, and I always remember the quote from the Bible: "Unless you become like unto a child, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." And storytellers speak to the child within us.
Yeah,
and that's one of the things I love about stories.
I love that too.
Jesus told a lot of stories too.
Now, and many religious and other icons are great storytellers, right? And you're a great storyteller. For people who don't think that they're a great storyteller, maybe they can't retain the stories in their memory bank or can't access it well. Is it okay to read a story to a client?
Absolutely, yeah. It's good if you're going to read a story to a client to say, you know what, I want to get this just right for you, and this other person said it so well, I want to just read to you. And if it's during formal trance, you can even say, you might hear some pages turning, and that will just reassure you that I'm finding the perfect words for you in this moment. And of course, I'm a very experienced storyteller. I do storytelling, not story reading, usually. But there's actually one passage which was written by Rob Brezhny in the book Pronoia, one of my favorite books. Dave Berman turned me on to that book. And he wrote it so brilliantly that I don't even bother trying to paraphrase it. I just say, I want to share these words with you. And I whip out that book and I read them as he wrote them. And they're magnificent. By the way, if you want to check out that passage, you can actually find performances, and he does it from memory, of Rob Brezhny performing. It's called Glory in the Highest, which I know sounds like it's going to be kind of religious and Christian-y. Don't let that turn you off if that's not your jam. And it's brilliant, and it's really about gratitude. Great passage.
Great, I just shared that in our chat room. Thank you. So, where else do you get your stories? Do you create them yourselves, or are you tapping into all those wonderful things that have already been existing for centuries?
Right. Well, I am not one to reinvent the wheel, and so I love taking stories that already exist and adapting them in some way for my clients. So you can find stories all kinds of different places. We all grew up with certain fairy tales, and those fairy tales taught us lessons. They conveyed ideas to us. There are great sources that you can review: Aesop's fables, the parables of Christ. Even though I personally am not a Christian, but man, those stories are great and they convey messages. The stories of the Buddha, stories from mythology of all different forms. There are great stories in Hindu mythology and Buddhist lore.
Native American?
Native American stories are fantastic. Mullah Nasruddin is one of my favorite genres of stories. I guess Mullah means teacher, and Nasruddin is this sort of fictional Sufi teacher, and he's sometimes called the wise fool. And Nasruddin stories are shared within the Arabic and Persian cultures, and many people interpret them as jokes, and oftentimes they do have kind of a funny twist to them, and it's traditional. People will sit around in coffee houses, and if you tell one Nasruddin story, you're supposed to tell at least two more, or somebody at the table. So you have a whole set of three, which is a great excuse if you like to tell stories, and you tell one, you're like, well, I'm sorry, by tradition, I have to tell you two more. And now I do also make up stories. I will convey stories based on my own experiences or experiences other people have had, because part of being a storyteller, I think, is being a story gatherer and sort of adjusting your perceptual filters to notice what can be useful as a metaphor for someone in the future. And it's kind of funny. Doug O'Brien, by the way, a great storyteller and hypnotic teacher, he and I are planning to do an online storytelling circle. And we were debating, about what to include. And he says, well, I want all original stories. I'm like, dude, I'm the folklore guy. I like traditional stories. I don't make up new stories. And then I realized, what am I saying? I am gathering and creating new stories all the time, sometimes based on my own experience, like with my smoking cessation clients. A lot of times there's little things that are going to be objections, like in the sales world, they're like, address their objections before they raise them. One of those objections is, well, what do I do if I reach for my cigarettes and they're not there? So I tell my clients a story about how a few years ago, I bought a car that was new to me, and it had a technological advance over my old truck in that it has keyless entry, right? And they usually nod. Pretty much everybody's experienced keyless entry by now, and so it doesn't have quite as much of a wow factor. But I say, and it's great. You just walk over to the car, open the door, and it knows it's me as long as I've got that key fob in my pocket. I don't have to even take it out. I don't have to literally have a key to shove in there. I just push a button. It's amazing. But the thing is, for about a year after I got that car, as I was walking over to it out of habit, I would just reach into my pocket to pull out that key fob. And when I would do that, I would think, oh no, I'm so addicted to this key fob. Oh, it's so powerful and I'm so weak and helpless. Ah! No, I didn't say that. I would say, hey, I've upgraded. My life is better. I don't have to do that anymore.
Beautiful. Yeah.
You know, and so I don't have to give them the suggestion, though usually I'll repeat it during the formal trance, that if you happen to reach for your cigarettes or have the thought of them, you smile and say, I've upgraded.
Right. You can use that story to reframe, the stories that they arrive with that maybe are not helpful with them. And, that I work a lot with kids. And it's my cause to get the kids to really be interactive in the session. I certainly don't want to just be, which can be challenging anyway, to get a kid into some kind of relaxed state and then just feeding direct suggestions into them. I want them to get empowered by coming up with solutions. And so often we'll be doing some forms of storytelling where we're co-creating and discovering those resources and the answers that they need. So, we know that clients arrive in our office with their stories. And sometimes they're stuck or frozen in those stories. And so it's our job to help them weave a new one. And how often do you do that to really involve the client in providing those ingredients?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good question. And, there's a whole school of story therapy around making this a very formal process where the clients will literally write out a story, and then in like a group session, they'll get up and they'll tell their story, of that metaphorically describes what they've been through and how they learned these things and all that. And I don't tend to do that as a formal process the way that a lot of the story therapy people do. But what you're describing is really very similar to what I'll do. A lot of times I will throw out a couple of possibilities to my clients, and I'll listen to what's the metaphor they're coming in with. What's the thing what's the story they're telling themselves? And yes, we will co-create, and I will tend to kind of tell them back that story that we've co-created about how things are changing now and how things are getting better. And admittedly, sometimes I will just hand them a new premise. One of my favorites, we get a lot of people who have anxiety in one form or another. In fact, almost everything that I deal with my clients is some form of anxiety. And I love it because anxious people are great at hypnosis. Because they've been hypnotizing themselves this whole time. So I explain hypnosis is that art of getting real results from imaginary events. And I'll usually take them through a lemon visualization so they experience that in a very visceral way. And I say, you can think about these things that bother you and you feel your heart rate speed up, right? You feel these physical things. They're like, yeah, I do. That's a superpower. They're like, what? Right? Reframe. It's a superpower, and like every superhero, you are misusing your superpower at first, and you have to go to an old man with a gray beard to teach you to use your superpower effectively. And what I do then is I've changed the premise of the story. And from there on, we're creating a new story in which they play a role of the emerging hero or the Padawan. I've had clients where I call them Padawan the whole time. And so I don't, like I said, I don't do it like some of the story therapy people where it's a real formal process, but informally, I think every client I'm helping, and I think most of us are helping a client live and create a better story for themselves.
And that can come at any point of a session in their visit with us. And I know that you're like me, you do a lot of your work before the formal hypnotic ritual and, seeding and priming and actually eliciting change during that time. And then we can use that formal hypnosis for compounding and giving direct suggestions, but feeding back elements of that story or the entire story that is now being rewritten and recreated. Do you ever have clients carry that on further? You know, you'd mentioned about more formal narrative therapy, having them write the stories out. I'm thinking of some clients that have written even some of their hypnotic experiences and sent them to me later. I was working with a cancer care client once who had an incredible creation happen in his hypnosis session with me, where he's a biology teacher, and all the students in his class, when they found out about his diagnoses, folded 1,000 white cranes and made a mobile for it and hung it over his desk in the classroom. And in hypnosis, those cranes became the white blood cells that were conquering the cancer. And so he wrote an absolutely beautiful script that I then made into an audio recording for him. And so that was such a great collaborative process that way. Do you ever encourage clients or have had clients do that?
You know, I tend to let that happen organically if it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Some people I find might feel a little too pressured if I tell them to create something.
Okay.
But I may encourage that. I might seed that and let it happen organically. You know, your story reminds me of a client I had who came to me because of kind of generalized anxiety and stage fright. He was a songwriter, and he was getting ready to record an album, and he was really nervous about the microphone. And I helped him to reframe a lot of that. And of course, I told stories from my own experience as a performer. I'm not just a storyteller, like I said. I'm also a musician, and so we could relate. We had instant rapport. And about a year later, he sent me a video, and he said, "Hey, this is a video of a song from my new album, and I want you to pay attention to the lyrics at this particular moment." Okay, yeah. So I check it out. I'm like, wow, man, this guy, he's just like owning the stage. He's really just doing it, man. His band is rocking. It's totally awesome. And I get to that point, and his lyric was, "I had a little hypnosis for a little neurosis."
That's great. That's wonderful to have that affirmation, that recognition, even though no one else knew that was you. It is confirming to us, and it keeps us doing what we're doing. When we get that kind of feedback in a piece of art like that, it's fantastic. I'm curious, do you ever use any props in your storytelling with your hypnosis clients?
Mhm. So I don't go out of my way to use props. Now, a minute ago, I did use a prop that I happened to grow myself, my beard. And I will occasionally, but for the most part, I think one of the advantages of storytelling is that we don't have to have a big prop department. We don't have to have an expensive special effects budget, because our clients have the most powerful visual effects and special effects team right there in their heads. So my answer really is no, unless I'm thinking, okay, this is really going to help a lot. Now, I will confess, I cheat a little bit. And so there's a process that that Scott Sandland developed, that it goes by various names, but the pain train, I think, is what he calls it, where you have your client just imagine there's a train full of everything they've ever run from, and for the first time ever, they turn and face it, and it slams right through. It's really it's intense. And a few years ago, I managed to acquire a train whistle. They sell them at like toy stores and stuff, and so I keep it hidden in my drawer. And when we get to that point, the client's eyes are closed, and I'll blow the train whistle, and then I'll hide it when we're done. And so they'll open their eyes and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I could actually hear the train whistle!" And I'm like, Really? Wow, that means that it was really powerful for you. Uh, for the most part, though, I think those are enhancements. I know that sometimes with kids, it's a little bit more effective to bring in a definite prop. Um, I try to keep a number of nautilus shells around. You know, those are actually they're ammonite shells, but they're the same pattern as a nautilus shell, that spiral shell. And you know, you can buy them for 12 for a few bucks on Amazon, and it's a crystallized fossil, and they've been cut in half so you can really see the pattern. And I'll often take that out and hand it to my client, and I will tell the story. And look, from a novelist viewpoint, this isn't a great story, but that's the cool thing, is our stories don't have to have an amazing story arc. They just have to present a metaphor, something that's useful. And I'll tell the story of how the creature that made that, thousands of years ago, though creatures are still doing it today, and they've been doing it longer than the human race has existed. The creature was originally so small that we can't even see it with our naked eye. We can't see the smallest chamber. And it made that little chamber around it. And it did it to be safe and to give itself some structure. And limitations, boundaries are very important. They're very good for us to have that structure. And then it became too confining. And it started to feel the stress and the pain of that confinement. And it expanded. It moved out of that chamber into a whole new space and built a slightly bigger chamber, not massively huger, but just a little bit bigger. And that chamber also faced a slightly different angle, not a hugely different angle, just a slight different angle. And at first, when it moved into that chamber, no doubt, if it had had a human mind and was thinking, it would have been saying, "Oh my gosh, where are the walls? Where are my limitations? What am I doing here? Ah, ah." But pretty soon, it would have gotten used to what was around it, and it would have grown comfortable with these new walls, these new boundaries that protect it, as well as guide it. It would have gotten used to this new direction until it became too tight and too confining once again, and it began to feel the stress of that situation. And it could have taken some Xanax, right, and just chilled out and lived with the problem, but it didn't. Instead, it said, no, I have to grow, I have to expand. So it grew into a new chamber, and it kept doing that, shifting its angle, its perspective, just a little bit every single time, until eventually it had come full circle. And at that point, it might have gone, oh no, I'm facing the same direction I was when the problem started. Have I made any progress at all? Well, yes, it has, because it's come full circle. And maybe some of those same problems are coming up again, and they have to be dealt with. But now it's bigger, it's stronger, it's expanded. And it finds those things easier to deal with, and it keeps building and keeps building, until finally it's created this beautiful structure. And the fascinating thing is it can never go back. It can't retreat into one of those smaller spaces. And yet that reminds me of a book written by C.S. Lewis. Now, you probably know about the Chronicles of Narnia, famous kids' books by C.S. Lewis. He was a good friend of J.R.R. Tolkien, and we've all heard of The Lord of the Rings, of course. Now, he wrote this book called The Great Divorce. And The Great Divorce was a counter to William S. Blake's The Great Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in which Blake, a mystic, said that heaven and hell were the same thing. And C.S. Lewis, who was a Christian writer, said, no, heaven and hell are completely different. And his premise was that there's a bus tour from hell to heaven. And you can briefly go experience heaven. And hell for him was this dreary, rainy, dull, boring place. And heaven was this place full of amazing things. And all the characters who go there, they experience growth, and they let go of their personal demons, and they expand, they grow, they learn. And at one point, one of these souls, kind of the main character who's been observing all this, says to one of their guides, sort of an angelic figure, if you can do this, why don't you go down into hell and help the people there? And the angelic figure says, well, first of all, you have to board the bus. You have to make the decision that you want something better. And second, I can't fit in hell. I'm too big. And actually, at this point, you can't fit back in hell either. You're too big. You've grown too much. You've expanded so much that you can't go back to your own personal hell anymore, any more than that Nautilus or that Ammonite could go back into its smaller limiting chambers. And so sometimes I'll even say to my client, I want you to keep that. I want you to put it in your pocket, or you can make it into a pendant. Sometimes I even make them into pendants and give them to my clients and say, I want you to wear this. I want you to carry this. I want you to take it out and think about that and realize that you're making progress. That sometimes it won't seem like it, but you're making progress. You're expanding and you're growing, and you have no choice but to continue.
James, that reminds me of a girl who was running a webinar with a great master storyteller. And as he spun his tales and wove these stories, she found herself drifting off into a state of belief. And before she knew it, the time was just disappearing. And I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but I find it happens frequently to me because I live hypnotically. And, you probably also might be thinking of how great minds think alike, because I was going to ask you about this thing called a nested loop.
Yes.
What is that? And how do we use those?
Right. It's a nested loop storytelling. That's advanced storytelling. But I actually threw a nested loop into that story. And the thing is that we've all experienced nested loops a bunch of times, and we didn't realize it because we swim in stories the way that fish swim in water. So a nested loop, very simply, is a story within a story. Now, if you want to get fancy, then you can have a story within a story within a story, or a story within a story within a story within a story. And I really love the image of those Russian nesting dolls. And now that's a prop that I sometimes use to explain nested loops. And the structure is really pretty simple. You start a story and you create a sense of curiosity. You create some suspense, and on a neurological level, suspense creates dopamine. Now, dopamine we know as a feel-good neurochemical. It's one of the happy hormones, as they like to call it. It's also the one that we get when we pay attention, right? When you see the tiger in the grass, dopamine, right? Pay attention to it. It helps with the formation of long-term memory, which is why lessons need to be interesting. It's why your hypnosis session can be interesting, because you form long-term memories. It's why, of course, laughter is another thing that we're really into. And
right.
Laughter releases dopamine. It's why learning can be fun. So you get that sense of suspense, and we all know suspense, right? We remember the idea of a cliffhanger, where a character would literally be suspended over a cliff, and then, oh, we'll continue next week, right? Or as is a frequent structure in the television shows, which we all love to watch. I know you're all binging them. You get to the end of one and there's a big reveal. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen? I have to watch the next one, right? Or very often in television, they'll get to a point, they'll get you interested, curious. For instance, Chopped, right? And now we'll reveal who just got chopped. Cut to commercial, right? So you're at maximum dopamine, maximum suspense. And then they tell you another little story about this housewife who discovered that Gain works better than the other leading brand. And you're like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care. So your critical faculty is busy waiting for the conclusion of that story. And they're like, oh, well, let us tell you this other little story. It's about how Geico can save you 15% or more on your car insurance. And oh, look, you love that little gecko, don't you? He's so adorable. You like him, don't you? And he wants to help you out. Yeah, okay, right. Now get me back to the story.
Wow, I've never before thought of commercials as being nested loops, and you are so right. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
And I've often recognized the hypnotic nature of and influence of them, but that's such a great frame. Thank you.
Sure.
There's another question in the chat room. Michelle said there's a great NLP technique, the hero's journey, based on Joseph Campbell's work, and many films like Star Wars are based on that structure. Do you use that?
No. Everybody asks me that. No, I don't, because and the hero's journey is great. And look, I love Joseph Campbell's work. He's amazing. But and yeah, you can structure a whole weekend workshop around the hero's journey, and you can do all kinds of things. And yes, there's certain elements of it that are going to be more or less universal. But honestly, you don't have to be that complicated and that fancy to use hypnotic storytelling. Stories can be much simpler. And there's a lot of different structures that people analyze for stories. There's a lot of different patterns. There's a lot of different ways of categorizing stories. One of the ways of telling stories for sales, for instance, is what we call the feel, felt, found structure, where, wow, do you feel like you don't really understand how to become a better storyteller? I actually felt that way at one point. Even though a lot of people were telling me I was a good storyteller, I had no idea how I'd gotten there. But I found that I could look back over what I had learned and analyze it and break it down. And so I found a way to teach you to be a better storyteller, right? That's a feel, felt, found structure. And by the way, Doug O'Brien teamed up with Craig Eubanks to teach a class on hypnotic storytelling, and it's totally different from anything I teach. And that's basically what they teach, is the feel, felt, found structure. Dan Harmon actually has what he calls a story circle, which is frustrating to those of us who want to sit around in a story and tell sit around in a circle and tell stories. But it breaks down a way to structure stories. And so every episode of every show that he creates, he plugs the stories into those. If the hero's journey is useful to you, go ahead and do it. I find that it's actually more complicated than what I need. Now, the idea of casting my client as a hero is very useful. And in that way, I help guide them through their own hero's journey. But those structures are already built in to stories. They're already baked in. And so while, yeah, I really enjoy Joseph Campbell, I haven't really found that I need to structure my work around his.
I love the message that you're sharing here today, James, is that it really can be much simpler. And we hypnotists tend to overcomplicate things and overanalyze, and really, it is simple. And especially if we're utilizing who the person is in front of us, what they bring with their own perspectives and experience, then really we have all the material that we need. We have the fodder to be able to craft those stories that are going to elicit change, and also to let them experience that on that level that talks to their subconscious, to all parts of their body even. And I'm one of the believers that feels that the subconscious is contained in all the cells of the body, all the cells that have a mind of their own. And so even to have stories that are somatic in nature and letting people act out their stories can be really an amazing transforming process. Is that something that you ever do?
Yeah, absolutely. And back to, of course, working with children, kids love to act out a story. They love to take that action, and so I'll often combine techniques that I use with adults. I love to use Amy Cuddy's power poses. Um, I love to have people sort of visualize and pantomime these changes that they want, sometimes while taking on a very heroic stance, sometimes while laughing, a big hero's laugh, um, as they're doing these things to build in that somatic component. But like I said, kids absolutely love it. So we'll engage in some role playing. Of There was this one adorable little girl. Oh my gosh, she was so much fun to work with. And she initially came to me because she had a problem with eating things that she wasn't supposed to eat. And her mother was, at her wits' end. How do I get this kid to quit eating the shampoo, right? And so I talked to her about, a kind of a character. I don't remember what character we had. Maybe it was an elephant. I have a stuffed elephant in my office that clients of all ages like to hold on to. And of course, you're probably familiar with, I have a whole collection of stories about elephants. Well, I kind of made up one for her about this elephant who was learning to live with humans. And at first, the elephant wasn't sure about certain things, like where to poop. And so the elephant would go into the kitchen and poop. And she's like, oh, right, laughing. And I say, and then the elephant wasn't sure where to get food to eat. So the elephant would go into the bathroom and eat the soap. And that didn't go well. And it kept blowing soap bubbles out of its trunk and feeling indigestion and sick. And she's laughing her head off about this. And I start weaving in this idea that there are certain places where food is stored and certain places where not food is stored, and you don't poop in the kitchen. Kind of goes back to the old sign that friends of mine had when I was a kid that said, "I don't swim in your toilet. Please don't pee in my pool." So then I would say, so the elephant learned that when it would see the soap and start reaching for it, it would pull back its trunk. Could we do that right now? And so we would practice doing that, pulling back, saying, "Oh no, that's not food," and laughing. And likewise, going into the kitchen, saying, "Oh, there's a banana. Let's have that banana. Oh, here's some food my mother made for me. Let's go ahead and eat that." And so we would pantomime doing that as she lived the story of her changes. And I'm sure you've had to do this too. When a parent brings a kid to you for hypnosis, you have to kind of go, okay, let me explain. This isn't going to be a pocket watch. This isn't going to be your kids just silently listening to every word that I say. This is going to look like we're just goofing around, having fun, and telling stories. Because the kids are ready for that, but the parents sometimes don't know how to handle it.
Right, this is true. And I love how you can take the base of your elephant stories and then customize it and be able to use elements of them. So, how can hypnotists start to develop their level of storytelling skills? Obviously, by reading and listening to a wide variety from those resources that you mentioned. Is there anything specifically that we can do to have it flow organically? What are some secrets you can share with us?
Sure. So, of course, we probably all told the story, so I won't tell it in great detail, about the violin teacher who spent years saving up her money so that she could go hear an amazing concert by a concert violinist in New York City. And of course, she gets to New York City and she gets lost. But she sees a street musician playing the violin and figures he knows how to help her find the concert. So she goes over to him and says, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And he says, "Practice, practice, practice." Well, practice, practice, practice. Now, the good thing is that you can practice when there's no audience. Just as many of us have hypnotized teddy bears, you can tell a story to a teddy bear. You can tell a story even out loud while you're driving if you have a commute. Not that any of us have a commute anymore, but and in fact, my music partner, he observed one time that I will workshop a story or a joke, and I'll tell it to him, and he thinks I'm just making conversation, and then I'll tell it to my wife, and she's like, "Okay, all right, all right." And and of course I'm rehearsing it in my mind a number of times. I'm tweaking it. How can I make it better? How can I? And then I'll tell it on stage. And he's like, "You were workshopping that. You were planning that the whole time." I'm like, "Yeah, of course." So you can practice these things silently, which is great. Or if you're in a place where people won't lock you up for speaking out loud, you can practice them aloud. So of course, practice, just like every other skill you've ever learned. Now, at the same time, practice is balanced with study. And there's certain ways to study, and I'll get into a few of those. The third thing is really just recognize you are already a natural storyteller. You already tell stories. The element, and as a hypnotist, you're even better, because the elements that make good hypnosis make good storytelling. We've probably all learned that to elicit a state, you want to remind a person of a time they've experienced it and ask them to either out loud or silently review the sensory experience of it. In other words, what did you see when you were in that moment? What did you hear? What did you feel physically and emotionally? What did you smell? What did you taste? What other details made it more real for you? And look, we've all learned how to do this. It's a basic hypnotic process. That's the basic process of telling a good story. Likewise, we're all pretty much pretty good at visualizing. Not everybody. I know some people don't tune in to visualization, but most of us are probably used to picturing the things we're asking our clients to picture, right? If I'm telling my client, close your eyes and imagine that you're floating in a sea of stars, I'm picturing that sea of stars in my own mind. And I'm saying, and if there are two gateways that form on either side of you, I'm picturing those gateways. I'm describing what I'm seeing to my client. And I bet a lot of you already do that. That's how I tell stories. I create a mind movie for myself of the story, and I describe it to my client.
Now, Michael Elner taught me many years ago to get out of my own head. And, if people have heard that phrase before, really what that means is to be in the moment and not to be thinking about what protocol or maybe the formal structure of the story or any of those other details that prevents us from really connecting with not just the person there with us, but with that creative part of our mind. Do you do any kind of ritual to move into a storytelling process that allows you to get out of your own head?
So I don't do a ritual for it now, because I've done it so many times that I'm used to it. Now we did mention earlier, actually, I have my pendant, which of course I got because Michael Elner recommended these many years ago, and some of us even call this our Elner pendant. And it's kind of I'm a storyteller now, and I'm a hypnotist now. So I put it on when I'm going to be doing hypnosis for people, and it's an anchor for me. And so I've practiced this enough that I know how to shift. And it's a very similar shift to that I go to when I'm playing music. And very often when I'm playing music, I'll intentionally say to myself, okay, take a deep breath, relax, let the music flow. The music's going to play me. I'm not playing it anymore. And there's a balance. There's a cat's cradle. right? If I had not spent years playing scales, if I had not worked on these tunes slowly before I play them fast, if I had not applied all of the Apollonian logic side of things to develop these skills, then when I just let go and say, okay, whatever happened, it would suck, right? But at the same time, if I was too caught up in my head, like Michael would have said, if I was too caught up in the protocol and the order and all of that stuff, that would suck too. So it's a matter of finding that balance, letting yourself have just enough of those tools built up that you can then let it all go. And you know, the thing is that this might sound kind of daunting or weird, but we've all done it as hypnotists. We've all had that moment where the various things we built up and the analysis and all of that and just the years of kind of machine learning of just hearing it over and over again, all of a sudden it starts coming out.
Yeah.
One great resource that I usually mention is a book called My Voice Will Go With You, The Hypnotic Stories of Milton Erickson, as edited by Sidney Rosen. And when I first read that book, and by the way, what I recommend for that book is you put it in your bathroom and just read a story or two every time you sit down on the toilet. As long as you're clearing your head, you might put something useful in it. And so...
Okay, well, wait a minute, James. There's state-dependent memory.
Well,
you may get in trouble with that.
Yeah, that's well, although, but you know.
Hey, you know what? I just saw a clip of a Zoom meeting where the gal took her phone into the bathroom and, you know, forgot that her video was still playing. Everyone there was laughing too hard. So, you know, in this new world of online sessions and meetings, anything can happen.
Right. But so that was a great little nested loop. I want to get back to my story about My Voice Will Go With You. Nested loops are natural.
Yes, they are.
So when I first read that book, I was really just in awe. How on earth did Milton Erickson come up with this stuff? How did he know to do these things? And occasionally he'll try to give you little hints or glimpses, but I just thought I could never do this. And then I was doing a session. And by the way, it was a phone session back in the day before that was a requirement. But I had a client who had actually found me online, and she had sadly suffered terrible abuse in her life and wasn't comfortable even being in the same country with her hypnotist. So we would meet every Thursday night and talk on the phone. I have no idea what she even looks like. But anyway, all of a sudden, I was doing it. All of a sudden, I was crafting these stories and metaphors that were just bubbling up from inside the unconscious. And I was blown away by this experience. And afterward, I remembered one of the stories I'd read was about Milton Erickson as a young man, as a college student, wanting to write a letter to the editor of a local newspaper about an important issue. And he sat down, and he had a little one-room apartment, very tiny, and he had a little tiny manual typewriter, and he put his blank sheet of paper in it, and he typed out the date, and he typed out, "Dear Editor," and then he stared at the blank page and didn't know what to say. And he stared at it so long that he started drifting off to sleep and nodding off, and finally he just crawled into bed. And the next morning, he woke up and he thought, oh, I still have to write that letter. And he looked over, and without his glasses on, it was blurry, but he could see the page was covered in type. And he realized that at some point in the night, in a literally somnambulant state, he had gotten up and covered the page. And so, trusting his unconscious, he pulled it out, folded it into three, put it in the envelope that he had already addressed and stamped, licked it, sealed it, and sent it. And a few days later, he got a call from the editor of the newspaper who said, I just received your letter. I've read it 3 times. It's brilliant. Would you be willing to become a regular columnist for me? I think even Erickson knew to study, to train, to prepare, to put a lot of good stuff in, and then to let go and let it flow.
I love how you described that moment that you remember in that phone session when you felt that flow. And I think that many of us remember those similar times when everything just became very natural and easy. And I think those are major shifts in the way that we work when that happens. And I do believe that can happen for everybody. And especially if new hypnotists are wondering, when will that happen for me? It will. It will happen as long as you do what you're suggesting, James. Be open to it and to put in that time and energy towards the practice, towards the learning aspect of it, because all of that sinks in, and then there'll be that magic shift, and it's so rewarding. It's so marvelous when that occurs. So you had said that you had some other tips for us and how we can be developing this, and what do you think about these collaborations? You tell me what you're doing. You're putting together a storytelling online platform.
So we're going to use Zoom. It's the natural tool, and Doug O'Brien and I, we each have our own Facebook groups dedicated to storytelling. He has original 2-minute stories, which is really fun. It's a neat constraint to work with, to tell a whole story in just 2 minutes. It's a little bit like a haiku in a way, and I had a lot of fun creating one for his group. I have the Order of Spellbinding Storytellers, which is a little bit more open-ended, and it's a place for people to share information about stories, to upload videos of themselves telling stories and get a little bit of feedback.
That's a Facebook group.
Right, yeah, and it's a Facebook group as well. And so Doug and I, we were both thinking about, okay, we need to just hold a storytelling circle. The Decameron, one of the great collections of medieval stories, actually, the premise for it, the overall frame, because it's kind of a bunch of loops nested in this big story, was that during the Black Plague, a bunch of people went to hide out in a castle to essentially self-isolate, and they had nothing to do, so they told stories. And so all the stories in the Decameron are the stories that the people told. And I said, of course, it doesn't make sense for us to go all hang out in a castle together, but we have the internet, so let's do that. So, and Doug had a very similar idea. So we haven't declared the exact time or the date. We're going to select 10 people out of a number of people who've said, oh, yeah, I'd be happy to tell a story. We'll select 10 of them. We'll ask them to do 5-minute stories. Doug said, I'd rather they were original stories. They don't have to be personal narratives like The Moth insists on, but they should be original stories. And I said, okay, I like retelling other stories, but it's fine. And so we're going to have a lot of fun with that. You'll be able to find out about it if you join the Order of Spellbinding Storytellers on Facebook, which is my group, and so you should go ahead and join there. Now, once you're there, it's pretty easy to keep up with some other resources that I provide. I have a podcast called the Hypnotic Stories Podcast. I decided not to make it a confusing title. And basically, I and guest storytellers tell stories on this podcast. We also answer a few questions. We address some concerns people have. For instance, a lot of people are worried that if somebody pays for hypnosis and they just tell them stories, that their client will be frustrated and angry and leave. Well, that's never, ever happened to me. Even though there are a few clients for whom all I did was tell stories, but they recognized what was going on. In most cases, storytelling is a part of this complete session. It's one of the many tools that I use along with direct suggestion, along with circle of excellence, along with all of our various NLP techniques, along with using nested loops in formal trance, along with conventional inductions. So so we address questions like that in the podcast.
And James, what's the best place for someone to access your podcast?
So I would recommend actually that if you're on Facebook, you just join the Order of Spellbinding Storytellers. There's a pinned post that has the link for the podcast, and that way you stay connected. And likewise, you can go to hypnoticstorytellingcourse.com, where I am actually creating and releasing some storytelling course products. I'll have them at various levels. And there's even a free mini course that you can sign up for there. I know when we first talked about this, I said, you know, I should have my courses completely done because, by golly, we're on lockdown and I have nothing to do. And since then, everybody and their brother has asked me to do things. So I don't quite have the grand courses done yet, but cross my fingers, they'll get done and ready to be released pretty darn quickly. They're so close.
Well, everything in its right time, right? And what timing that is. And if anybody here has any final questions for James, we're going to start wrapping this up. But what a wonderful visit with you. And I've learned some new things. And I think that whether you're telling stories that have been around for the ages or using client stories, making them your own, there's real power in that. And I think that you're a great example of how you do that. Your mastery in taking a story and giving it a whole new essence is pretty renowned, James. And I'm so honored to know you and call you my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, that feeling is mutual. You're a leader in the hypnosis community, and you lead what I gather is actually probably the best hypnosis forum on Facebook and possibly in the world. And but I'm not quite willing to do what I would need to do to be eligible to join. So
happy to hear that.
I am really honored. I'm honored that you've allowed me to come here.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody. And, you know, I see the Elmans there. Hi, you guys. Nice to have you here too. And people from all over the country and the world joining us. And this webinar will be recorded and archived for people that have missed it, or if you want to watch it again. And in the meantime, James, thank you. Thanks for sharing some of those resources. And I'll see you around the campfire telling some stories.
All right. Thank you so much.